Have you ever looked at maybe a group or an organization that felt like it used to be this real force, changing things, but now it just seems well settled?
Yeah, like it's more about maintaining things than really pushing forward.
Exactly. And that's what we're really digging into today in the deep dive. We've got this stack of source material, and it's exploring a pretty specific and honestly a really challenging question.
Which is how these established denominations, but really you could say any settled organization, how they can transition back to being dynamic, to being, well, movement-oriented again.
Right. And the sources really focus on the role of let's say, the central body, the headquarters, the administrators.
Yeah, what part can they play?
Right.
I mean, it seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? The most structured part trying to get things moving again, like a movement.
It does. So our mission here is to pull out the really core insights from these sources. What does this kind of change actually involve? What are the hurdles, the tensions you just know are going to come up?
And maybe even, what does success look like in this context? Because you're kind of trying to deliberately shake things up.
Yeah. It's such a common thing you see, though, this life cycle.
Oh, absolutely. Mission groups, evangelistic initiatives, aid organizations.
Hmm.
And yes, definitely denominations. They often kick off with this incredible burst of energy, this real urgent sense of mission, almost like a spontaneous movement.
But then, over time,
Things get formalized, structures get built, processes are put in place, refined, and sometimes that initial dynamism it just sort of fades.
right. So the big question these sources are wrestling with is how can the very heart of that structure, the headquarters, be part of rediscovering that movement energy, part of becoming a movement again?
And I think to really get that, we have to start where the sources do.
Hmm.
We need to unpack the fundamental difference between what they call organizations and movements.
Okay.
Because it's not just semantics. It affects everything,
Yeah.
Who leads, how decisions are made, even where the money goes.
All right, let's break that down. The source is drawing some really clear lines, and maybe one of the starkest differences is how they define success.
Yeah.
For organizations, success often comes down to, well, what we do, running programs, hitting targets, the internal metrics.
Right. Measuring success internally, keeping
Yes.
people involved, keeping things stable.
And they're often satisfied with, incremental improvements, doing things a bit better next year. Accountability is mainly to the organization itself.
And when things get tough.
The priority tends to be organizational sustainability, keeping the thing going.
Okay, so that's the organization picture. How does a movement define success?
It's totally different. They define success by the ultimate goal, the big vision. One source even says, essentially, when the goal is achieved, everyone can go home because the job is done.
Wow. Okay, so success isn't about the group itself surviving.
Not primarily, no. Success is measured globally, you could say.
Yeah.
By the change achieved for everyone, the cause affects not just those inside the group. They're looking for sweeping, transformative change.
Not just incremental gains.
Exactly. And accountability. It's to something bigger, to the cause itself, which is seen as greater than any one person or even the group. So when hard choices come.
The cause comes first, not preserving the structure.
Right. One source puts it really sharply. Sustaining an organization is about sustaining order. Sustaining a movement is about sustaining action.
Order versus action. That's a huge difference in mindset.
It really is. And that difference plays out massively in leadership, too.
How so?
Well, in organizations, leadership is often tied to formal roles, right? Job titles, core competencies. You might have someone in charge who isn't actually doing the core work the organization exists for.
And they often look outside to recruit leaders for those specific slots.
Yeah, bringing people in to fill formal positions.
Yeah.
And who climbs the ladder? That's usually decided by other formal decision makers based on criteria that fit the existing structure. It's typically, hierarchical, an org chart.
And loyalty tends to be directed towards the organization itself.
Right. Now, contrast that with movements. Here, leadership is fundamentally based on values. Your decisions, your actions, they have to line up with the core beliefs driving the whole thing.
So it's not about the title.
Not primarily. Leaders are deeply involved in the actual activity of the movement, often without any formal title at all. Leadership kind of emerges from within.
Emerges from within. How does that work?
Anyone can step up and become a leader simply by taking initiative for the cause and inspiring others to join in. Your influence, your leadership, is sort of self-determined by what you actually contribute.
So it's much more distributed, fluid.
Yeah, distributed, agile, it flows to where the energy and the action are. It's not fixed on a chart.
And loyalty then isn't to the organization chart either.
No, the sources say loyalty in a movement is first to the cause itself and then to the other people who are actively working alongside you for that cause.
Yeah. And governance, how decisions get made.
It's less about compliance, oversight, risk management, like in a typical organization. It's more directly about living out the values, shaping strategy through doing things, and taking direct action towards the goal. Values are central to governance. Okay, that's
Mhm.
success and leadership. What about the means? How they actually operate, how they keep going?
Right. Organizations often start with the form, setting up the legal structure, the bylaws, defining how things are done, and then they value stability and efficiency within that structure. This is how we do things here.
And support often comes from?
Primarily from the outside, you could say. Customers paying for services, donors giving money, investors, patrons. Resources are often thought of mainly as cash,
Right.
and the systems they use often end up mirroring, business models or even how governments are structured.
Okay, so how does a movement approach its means? Does it flip that too?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
For movements, the mantra is more like form follows function. The structure, whatever it is, needs to be agile and effective for advancing the cause.
Right.
It changes as needed.
So it's not fixed.
Not necessarily. And support tends to build from the inside out. It starts with those most involved, most affected by the cause, and they draw others in.
And resources aren't just cash.
No, resources are seen much more broadly. It's people's time, their skills, materials, networks, whatever is actually needed. And interestingly, resources are often viewed as abundant, even if there's not much money, because the collective energy and contribution is the key resource.
That's a very different perspective.
It is. And their structures, if you can call them that, often look more like how communities naturally organize themselves to make life better together.
Okay, wow. That contrast is really stark across the board, success, leadership, means. So given all that, how on earth do the sources suggest that the denominational headquarters, the administrators, the most organizational part, play a role in shifting back towards being a movement? It sounds like asking the engine room to design a sailboat.
It does sound counterintuitive. And the sources definitely don't sugarcoat it. They say it's incredibly hard. But they do outline some really critical responsibilities for headquarters staff.
Like what?
First and foremost, they absolutely have to champion the vision. The vision to actually be a movement again. And this can't just be words on paper. It needs to be lived, breathed, communicated constantly, and genuinely shared right across the board.
Okay, so owning and driving that vision is job one. What else?
They have to intentionally cultivate the essential characteristics of a movement. The sources list 5 key ones.
What are they?
Okay, they are 1, a white-hot faith. 2, a deep personal commitment to the cause of Jesus. 3, contagious relationships, the kind that naturally lead to making disciples. 4, the ability to rapidly mobilize people into teams for action.
Okay, faith, commitment, relationships, mobilization. What's the fifth?
And 5, constantly, relentlessly reviewing everything, policies, systems, how things are done to make sure they're actually helping the gospel spread, that they support adaptive methods rather than getting in the way. The structure has to serve the movement, not the other way around.
So the administrators themselves need to embody these things, not just talk about them.
Precisely. They need to model it personally and push the whole system in that direction. And here's where it gets really interesting and maybe uncomfortable.
The one.
The sources say they're responsible for actively creating and managing tensions.
Wait, creating tension, not avoiding it.
Yeah.
That sounds backward for an administrator.
Doesn't it? But the argument is that the comfortable stability, the status quo of the organization, is the tension. It needs to be disrupted if you want movement, so they have to intentionally poke at that comfort.
Okay. What else?
They also have to oversee the change process itself, making sure it's not just top-down, that it involves people widely, and that it's developed and communicated with incredible care and transparency. People need to understand the why and the how.
And there's a personal dimension to this for the leaders, too, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Huge. The sources emphasize that denominational leaders, administrators, everyone in headquarters, they have to take full ownership of their own discomfort, because this kind of transition is massively disruptive.
That's it.
Well, life changes. Assignments change. People's professional identities get fundamentally challenged. The sources talk about needing to redefine your life and work away from organizational roles.
Towards movement roles.
Exactly. becoming things like seed sowers, church planters, church multipliers, multiplication trainers, or movement catalysts. That's a massive shift from, say, managing budgets or overseeing programs in a central office.
Redefining your whole professional identity.
Wow.
That really underlines how profound this change is meant to be. So, what are the big obstacles, the major tensions you inevitably run into when you try this?
Well, the sources point out something really ironic. Movements can actually start to falter because of their own success.
How does that work? Success seems like a good thing.
It does, but think about it. Financial stability, established buildings and institutions, comfortable routines, all the things that signal organizational success can, paradoxically, make the sacrifice, the risk-taking, the deep personal commitment that a movement requires feel, well, unnecessary to the current generation.
Ugh, the golden handcuffs problem. Things are too comfortable to change.
Sort of, yeah. Why rock the boat if everything seems to be running smoothly, right?
Yeah.
And that comfort creates real tension when someone tries to shift things back towards a movement footing.
So tensions flare up.
Big time. Over priorities. Should we fund the established program or this new risky initiative? Over control, how much autonomy do local groups get versus central direction? Over centralization versus distribution of power. Short-term needs versus that long-term movement vision. Disputes over policies. And maybe inevitably,
Money.
always money. It's often at the heart of it.
So what do the sources say about navigating that, the financial side?
They're really direct about this. There has to be a clear, concrete plan. It needs to show exactly where money will be saved by shrinking the organizational overhead, the maintenance structures,
Okay.
and crucially, where that saved money will be reallocated.
Reallocated to what?
To equipping and resourcing the people actually doing the movement work. The disciple makers, the church planters on the ground. The sources give examples like, encouraging local churches to keep tithes for local mission and planting instead of just sending it all to headquarters for staffing, or making hard calls about selling off expensive, underused buildings, or abandoning old, costly models like traditional mission stations that just drain funds.
So shift the money from maintenance to mission,
Yes,
basically.
the principle. Funds have to flow to the front lines of movement activity.
And policies need to change alongside the money.
Absolutely critical. The policy path has to align. Policies can't just be about control. They need to be rewritten specifically to equip and empower people for these new movement roles.
Like how?
Thinking differently about how pastors are trained and supported. Maybe changing what's taught in seminaries to focus on movement dynamics. But also adapting essential guidelines, things like child protection, safe environments, insurance, so they still provide safety, but also facilitate agile, decentralized activities, not just regulate static organization.
It sounds like the vision, the money, and the policies all have to move in lockstep.
They have to. If they're out of sync, the source is worn, the tension just becomes destructive and things stall. Negotiating that alignment is maybe the hardest part.
And it sounds incredibly risky politically within the organization.
Extremely. The sources call it a journey of great political risk. These transitions take years, often longer than any single leader's term in office.
So it's hard to see it through.
Very hard. Maintaining trust, keeping morale up when things are uncertain, and maybe even shrinking in some areas, it's tough. Especially when, let's be honest, most administrators and pastors are already overloaded.
Yeah.
And if the vision starts to feel like it's just temporary or unrealistic or just the flavor of the month from leadership, people won't make the deep personal investment needed. They'll just wait it out.
And I get the sense the sources don't paint this as a neat, tidy project plan.
Not at all. They're very clear. The path from being a settled organization back to being a dynamic movement is messy. It's chaotic. It's tough. There are very few guarantees.
But they seem to argue it's necessary anyway.
For many groups, yes.
Yeah.
They frame it as a path that, difficult as it is, might be essential if they're going to actually fulfill their original reason for being.
And you mentioned expecting resistance earlier.
Oh, yeah. The sources are blunt. Expect denial. Expect active resistance. Expect people to be hurt, angry, frustrated. Expect turf battles as people try to protect their roles or structures. Resentment from those who are comfortable.
That sounds painful.
It is. They even draw a parallel to the early church, the transition described in the book of Acts, moving from its Jewish roots to becoming a wider movement. That wasn't smooth either. There was grief, anger, major conflict. It was messy and chaotic.
So, given all that potential pain and chaos, what actually pushes an organization to even try this? What's the driving force?
The sources come back to the vision. They say only a truly compelling vision, one that's deeply rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ, empowered by his Spirit, only that has the power to motivate a comfortable, plateaued denomination to take such a difficult road.
It has to be that compelling.
It has to be,
Yeah.
because it requires making incredibly hard decisions, sacrificing things people consider sacred, but which are actually holding the mission back. The sources call these holy cows, breaking up the big rocks, the major structural or cultural obstacles that are blocking progress.
That vision needs real power to overcome all that inertia and, frankly, pain. But the sources do suggest some kind of process, right? Even if it's chaotic in practice, there can be a plan.
Yes, they do talk about needing a framework, maybe a multi-year plan, say 3-5 years, something to guide the shifts in funding and policy over time. It's not like the single rigid blueprint, but it illustrates the kind of coordinated, system-wide changes required.
Can you give us a flavor of the kinds of changes they map out across different areas?
Sure. It's like a phased approach, intentionally shifting assumptions. So for budgets, maybe phase 1 is just teaching about zero-cost church planting methods. Phase 2 is actively doing only that kind of planting. Phase 3 is using the money saved from downsizing structures to actively fund and resource movement leaders.
Okay, so it ramps up.
Right. Same for policies. Review everything through a movement lens, then draft major revisions, then keep adapting them as you learn. For administrators, it's not just managing. It's getting equipped in movement leadership, maybe participating in planting efforts themselves, some even shifting into roles focused on multiplying leaders or catalyzing new initiatives.
And this cascades down to pastors and church members, too.
Absolutely. Pastors are re-envisioned. First, equipped as seed sowers and planters, with job descriptions changing. Then, trained as multipliers of other leaders, maybe taking on district roles focused on multiplication. The ultimate vision is perhaps all pastors acting as multipliers, with some becoming key trainers and catalysts.
And church members, they're not just showing up on Sunday.
No, the idea is to equip members first as seed sowers confident to share their faith, maybe lead a simple discovery group, then identify and equip some members to become church planters. And then some of those might even become multipliers, starting new groups that start new groups.
It really is a fundamental shift in expectations for everyone. Even places like seminaries have to change.
Yeah, the sources suggest engaging seminaries directly, challenging them to embrace this Great Commission movement vision. Maybe faculty assess students for movement potential, not just academic knowledge. Curricula would likely need significant shifts to foster a movement mindset, not just prepare people to maintain an existing church structure.
Wow. It touches absolutely every part of the system.
It really does. It shows this isn't just about fine-tuning the existing machine. It's more like rebuilding the vehicle entirely for a completely different kind of journey.
Okay, so let's pull back a bit from this deep dive. We've been exploring these sources, looking at this huge challenge. How established organizations, especially denominations, can kind of rediscover their roots and become dynamic movements again.
And we've seen just how fundamental the differences are between an organization mindset and a movement mindset in how they see success, who leads, how they operate.
And we've really drilled into the key roles, often uncomfortable roles for those at the headquarters, championing that driving vision, actively cultivating movement characteristics, even managing necessary tensions.
Yeah, and overseeing what is inevitably a messy, difficult change process that forces everyone to rethink their roles and requires some really tough calls on money and policy.
The sources definitely don't shy away from the difficulty, the resistance, the sheer uncertainty of it all.
But they frame it as an essential path for many, driven by something deeper, that gospel-centered calling that has to outweigh the comfort of just keeping things as they are.
So whether you listening are part of a denomination or maybe another kind of organization that feels a bit stuck, or even if you're just interested in how groups evolve.
Understanding these core differences between organizations and movements and the intense dynamics involved in trying to shift from one to the other hopefully offers some real food for thought.
Yeah. And it leaves us, I think, with a really provocative question that comes right out of this material.
Which,
given this inherent tension, organizations needing structure for stability, movements needing that radical agility for impact, how can leaders possibly find the wisdom and maybe just the sheer courage to balance that necessary order with that disruptive, world-changing agility without crushing one or the other?
that's a question that definitely sticks with you. How do you hold those two together?
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining us for the deep dive.